Hi, this is my first video for YouTube. My name is Brett Kildahl. I am nominally a National Master of Chess. Right now my rating though is a little bit below 2200. I think it's 2176 maybe. Maybe it'll be 2180 something after the next tournament. I am a chess coach, a poker player, have a day job as well, and I was inspired to make this video by seeing a video that my opponent in this game made and also uploaded to YouTube. So I figured I'd upload my thoughts as well and maybe link to his video in the description and you can compare the two. Okay, so I had white and I was playing against a gentleman named Roger who's rated 1950, 1975. He's been as high as 2100 if I remember correctly. He had the white pieces here. And we were playing this game as part of a club championship in Fitchburg, Mass. So he played d4, I played knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and here black has all sorts of options. He can go into the King's Indian defense with bishop g7, e4, d6, and then for example knight f3, castle kingside, bishop e2, and you get what's called a classical King's Indian. Alternatively, black can play the move c5. White typically responds to that with d5, and then black can go into a Benoni with e6. Whoops. Gonna have to work the bugs out of this whole thing, but it's okay. Alright, where are we? Sorry. Alright. So you can play c5, and then after d5, you play b5 and go into what's called a Benko gambit. What I chose to do is enter a defense known as the Grunfeld, which is marked by the move 3d5. Black's idea is that he's allowing white to bring his knight to the center and then play the move e4 with tempo. And black typically in this position captures on c3. White gets a pretty big, pretty powerful pawn center, and then black tries to prove that it's actually a weakness somehow by putting the bishop on g7, pawn on c5, knight on c6, and so on, and trying to put a lot of pressure on the d4 square and force some kind of concession. This opening is similar to, but much better than, from black's point of view, the Marshall defense, and I'll show you that. After d4, knight f6, c4, sometimes black plays d5. And this is significantly worse than the Grunfeld, because after c takes d5, knight takes d5. When white eventually plays the move e2 to e4, there's no knight on c3 for the black knight on d5 to capture. And that trade is important for black because whenever you have significantly less space than your opponent, it's a good idea to trade pieces. It tends to, I mean, it doesn't eliminate it, but it reduces the impact that your space disadvantage has. Okay, so we've got the Grunfeld defense, d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5. Roger took on d5, which is normal. I think there are also all sorts of ways to decline the Grunfeld, but nothing wrong with this. And I think typically here, as I said before, white plays e4, and after knight takes c3, b takes c3, bishop g7, the game might continue bishop e3, c5, queen d2, castle kingside, or actually, I think... First one's going to be rough. White typically plays e4, knight c3, b c3, bishop g7, then for example bishop e3, c5, queen d2, queen a5, rook c1. I think black might castle here. Black later might put the rook on d8, knight on c6. I don't know much about this defense, and this is the first time I've played it successfully in a rated game. I tried to play it against another player during this championship, but he declined it. Alright, so Roger took on d5, and I took back with my knight, but he didn't play e4 here. He played knight f3 instead, which is fine. It just means he's delaying e4 by a move or two. I played bishop g7, and here I think it's probably appropriate for white to play e4. Knight takes c3, b takes c3, and we have the kind of position that I showed you a moment ago. Come on. Knight c3, d5, cd5, knight d5, knight f3, bishop g7. Okay. What Roger played instead is something that surprised me a little bit, and that's the move g3. And the reason it surprised me is that it's not an immediate e4, which is what I expected to see in the Grunfeld defense. And so I was thinking to myself here, how do I exploit the fact that white did not immediately play e4? And what I came up with is an idea that I've seen before in what's called the King's Indian defense. So I'll show you a variation from that defense that's worth paying attention to. Okay, so after d4, knight f6, sometimes white decides not to play c4. For example, because he's worried about the Budapest gambit e5. And so he plays the safer knight f3, and then tries to kind of back into a classical King's Indian, for example, after g6, c4, bishop g7, knight c3, castle e4, d6. We've found our way back to a classical King's Indian defense. But black here, since white has delayed the move e4 by one move, has an interesting alternative. I don't know if it's good or not, but it's at least interesting to look at. And that's to play d6 right away, rather than complete the fianchetto with bishop g7. And then after knight c3, to say to white, okay, you failed to play the move e4 on time, so now I'm going to stop you from playing it. Bishop f5. Again, leaving aside for a sec the question of whether or not this is a great idea for black, it's at least interesting. And black's idea now is that, for example, after g3, at some point black's going to play knight e4, is going to trade off white's queenside knight, and then is going to stick his light-squared bishop on e4. And the point of this is to make one trade of minor pieces on c3, and eventually another trade of minor pieces on g2. At some point this knight will have to move off of f3, and black will take on g2. And the interesting thing about putting the bishop on e4 in this kind of situation is that because white is missing his queenside knight, and because he is fianchettoed on the king side, there's no minor piece that white can use to attack the bishop on e4 without allowing a trade of bishops on g2. Okay, so it was this variation that I was thinking of when in the game Roger played g3, 6g3. And so I went ahead and played bishop f5, and the idea here again is that at some point white's queenside knight is going to be traded off, and white has already declared his intention to fianchetto on the king side. So once those knights get traded, you can see one of my cats in the background, that's Gigi. Once the queenside knight gets traded off, there's no minor piece that's going to be able to stop or going to be able to harass the black light-squared bishop on e4 without allowing a trade of bishops on g2. And if black can trade two pairs of minor pieces, then his space advantage doesn't mean as much negatively as it would otherwise. Okay, Roger played queen b3, very strong move, double attack, it's hitting the knight on d5 a second time, and it's hitting the undefended b7 pawn. So if black does not have a way to deal with those threats, then black is probably already in big trouble. In Roger's video, he said he was thinking I would play the move knight b6. I forget what else he recommended. But yeah, I had a different idea here, which was to trade on c3. And after he takes back with the queen or the pawn, to take over this long light squared diagonal with the light squared bishop. So that takes care of the problem on d5. There's no more piece winning capture on d5, and there's no more winning capture on b7 with the queen, because that's now defended by the bishop. Roger completed his kingside fianchetto, and now you can sort of see what I was talking about. If white's knight ever leaves, no matter where it goes, black will have a capture on the g2 square, and that will be a way of trading a second pair of minor pieces and getting closer to equality for that reason. So bishop e4, bishop g2, castle, castle. You know, depending on your skill level, you may know this already, but castle kingside tends to be the best or second best move, according to the computer, in almost every position in which it's legal. So you really can't, I mean you can, but you can almost never go wrong with the move castle kingside. So castle, castle, and now c5. A typical way for black, I think I showed this earlier, a typical way for black to try to break down the white center in the Grunfeld is to play c5 to put more pressure on d4. Right now these two pawns on c3 and d4 create a very effective way of shutting down the bishop on g7. But once black plays c5, there's more pressure on d4, and at some point a capture on d4 would leave this pawn on d4. You know what, I was about to say without defense from another pawn, but I'm thinking of the normal kind of Grunfeld variation in which white has played e4. So maybe this is a little bit different. c5, rook d1. Yeah, so black obviously has to try to finish his development by getting this knight on b8 into the game, and the rook on a8 and the rook on f8. But I already kind of felt like black was equal here while I was playing the game, and almost entirely because this bishop on e4 is neutralizing the bishop on g2, while there's no equivalent neutralization of the bishop on g7. Anyway, c5 was played with the purpose of putting pressure on d4. White plays rook d1, putting pressure along the d-file. My queen's on d8, so that can tend to be bad news. During the game, I was calculating this line c takes d4, and now if white plays c takes d4, well, it's not likely that my queen is ever going to be exposed to an attack from the rook on d1 sitting on the d-file. So my queen is now safe on the d-file. And if he plays knight takes d4, I was looking at the following variation. Bishop takes g2, knight to e6. Revealing an attack on the black queen. And now if black captures the knight on e6, there's rook takes d8, and then king takes g2. And the result is that white has a queen for a rook and a minor piece. And my experience has been that that tends to, that tends to favor the queen by a lot. So I was afraid of this variation. Get away. So that's why I didn't go into this, but it turns out the computer points out that black here has the move queen c8. And after this knight takes f8 move, I think there's just some issue with the light squares on the king side. They tend to be kind of weak, and maybe black has compensation for whatever material he loses in this variation. Okay, because I was afraid of that, I did not play c takes d4. I played queen c8 instead. My opponent played bishop to a3. Good way to activate that dark squared bishop. It's putting pressure on the pawn on c5 and the pawn on e7 and the rook on f8 behind it. So this is a really juicy diagonal for that dark squared bishop. I played knight a6, which in hindsight probably not a very good move. The only two squares up the board from where the knight is on a6 that knight can go to are guarded by white pawns. So it doesn't make tremendous sense to have this knight on a6. Not sure what I should have done instead. Maybe this was another opportunity to capture on d4. Let's see. C10. I'm not using a computer for this, so if my calculations are off, I apologize. C takes d4. Yeah, and now if, let's say, knight takes d4 and then bishop g2, the nice thing is that the queen knows she's safe on the c-file. A rook showing up on c1 is not going to result in the queen being under attack. Likewise, if c takes d4, well, now the queen can be attacked on the c-file, but she can no longer be attacked on the d-file. So the queen can at some point go to d7 or something and guard the b-pawn from there, and she has a safe square from which to have a lot of influence over the game. All right, I played knight a6 instead. Not a very good move. White played rook a to c1. Yeah, I mean, it activates the last piece. Looks reasonable to me. I think I was expecting that white would play d5 at some point here, although I don't remember exactly where. And I don't want to screw up this first recording too much. I just want to kind of get it over with and upload it and see how it goes. So rook a to c1, rook to b8, and my idea here is to find counterplay with b7 to b5, possibly followed by the move b5, b4. Breaking open the queen side, making this bishop on g7 more powerful than it is now. And there's no corresponding power from the bishop on g2 because my bishop on e4 neutralizes it. Roger here played a move that really surprised me. I could see a computer playing a move like d takes c5, but it's a very, to me, a very kind of non-human move because once white captures on c5, look at the white queenside pawn structure. Yes, white's technically up a pawn, assuming that black doesn't take back on c5. But that pawn structure is garbage. And this bishop on a3 is not a very good piece, blocked by the pawn on c5 and blocked by the pawn on b2. The bishop could eventually be activated on the king side, on the f4 square, g5, e3, something like that. But for now, this pawn structure is bad, and it makes a white minor piece bad on a3. And so it looks really kind of visually unappealing to me. I played queen c6. Okay, so I've seen, in my experience with chess, positions in which one player wins a pawn, but in doing so he messes up his own pawn structure and allows some kind of a blockade that hurts his pieces. And so here I played the move queen c6 with the idea that this pawn on c5 is blocking the bishop on a3. And I wanted to keep blocking the bishop on a3. And so the natural thing to do is to put a piece in front of that, or put something in front of that pawn to keep it from moving. Had I not done that, at some point white might have had the move c5, c6, freeing his bishop on a3, which would then be attacking along this a3, f8 diagonal. So I played queen c8. And queen c8 has a second point, which is that it puts more pressure along the a8, h1 diagonal. And now if white moves this knight in a way that doesn't deliver check, or attack a more powerful piece, or guard the bishop on g2. Well, those are a lot of options, but if white doesn't do that, black wins a piece on g2. So this pressure is somewhat meaningful, and it also creates this blockade of the c5 pawn that keeps the bishop on a3 from being a good piece. All right, the computer finds a move here that is very strong for white, and that's the move queen c4. And I think the idea is that white's now going to be threatening the move knight e5. For example, if we just make some, I don't know, non-move for black, white has the move knight e5. And if, I mean, obviously black doesn't want to take on g2 because he'll lose his queen. And if the knight on e5 is taken, then after bishop takes e4, black seems to be pretty weak on the light squares on the queen side. And this knight on a6 is a very bad piece. So, okay, the computer finds a nice tactic here, and for that reason the move queen c6 is not a good move. But I disagree with Roger's sentiment on the subject, because he seems to think that it's not a strong move strategically either. But I think it's very strong strategically. If white didn't have this move queen c4, or what Roger played in the game, I think this would just be a way to create a nice blockade and a lot of pressure along the long light square diagonal. It would be a very good move. Roger played queen d4, knight d4, and this creates an immediate tactical problem for black that can only be solved, I think, in a particular way. Obviously, if black takes the bishop on g2, he loses his queen, and that's not desirable. White's up the equivalent of a piece here. And if the queen moves away, unfortunately, it can't move to anywhere from which it can defend the bishop on e4. So, for example, queen d5, it can try to defend, but then there's just queen takes d5, bishop d5, and white's up a piece. So this move can only be responded to with bishop takes d4, as far as I remember. And there's a way for white to go wrong here, and that's to play bishop takes e4, which Roger pointed out in his video, because that allows bishop takes f2 check, king takes f2, and then queen takes e4, and white's pawn structure is totally shattered, and his king is exposed along these diagonals. And by the way, this brings up an important point that comes up over and over again in chess, which is that the movement of your f-pawn when you're castled kingside or are going to be castling kingside tends to be very weakening along those diagonals and along the 7th rank. So obviously he doesn't want to go into this variation. His pawns would all be weak and his king would be under attack. So what Roger played instead, correctly, is c takes d4, which very superficially looks like it loses a piece to bishop takes g2, which I played. But white can get the piece back by playing d5. simultaneously attacking the queen and cutting off the queen's defense of the bishop on g2. Okay, so now if black makes some normal move with the queen, I have no idea, you know, queen c7 or so, queen d7 or something, white's just going to take back on g2, and now white has repaired his pawn structure and is still up a pawn and has tremendous space with these pawns on c5 and d5 backed up by rooks. This game is arguably over already in white's favor. He has extra material, better pieces, more space. That should be the game. So after d5, again, it's kind of forced. The only reasonable move for black is to capture on d5. And this gives the piece back, but the piece was going to be given back anyway, and this way black eliminates possibly white's most important pawn, that pawn on d5. Okay, white can take back with the queen or the rook. I think I was more afraid of queen takes d5, taking a look at this d7 square. And if white can manage to get some heavy pieces onto black's 7th rank, this is going to be serious trouble, especially since white's bishop on a3, I think, is a piece with a little bit more potential than black's knight on a6. But Roger chose to play rook takes d5 instead, which allows the black knight to re-enter the game with tempo, knight to c7. And this is an interesting point in the game because something happens that I think you almost never see, and that's that I moved my knight on a6 6 times in a row. That's pretty unusual in a game between competent players to have one person think it appropriate to move a knight 6 times in a row. Knight c7, rook d3, natural place to retreat the rook to, and now knight e6. The knight is re-entering the game, controlling some central squares, putting pressure on the pawn on c5, and looking over at this g5 square, from which it will coordinate extremely well with the queen on c6. In fact, if black could immediately play knight h3 check, the result would be king f1 and queen to h1 checkmate. So white, without his light squared bishop on g2, the trading off of which was the purpose of bishop f5 to e4 earlier in the game, turns out to be weak on the light squares. And black has a corresponding weakness on the dark squares. Let's see if we can get rid of these. Okay. White at some point would like to put the bishop on b2 and the queen on c3, and then there's tremendous power along this diagonal. And these two squares are very weak. And if black doesn't have a way to stop that, that's just going to lead to checkmate. Okay, so knight to e6. Roger played queen to c3, beginning to create the battery I mentioned a moment ago. And I played knight to g5, the third move in a row with this knight. And yeah, this knight is going to move 3 more times before it stops. And that's because here, unfortunately, Roger blundered. What white has to play in this position is f3, just shutting down this light square diagonal so that the queen on c6 no longer coordinates with the knight on g5, and knight h3 check would be silly. It would achieve nothing. But Roger, I guess, miscalculated here and blundered with h4, which allows knight to h3 check. The problem now is that if the king continues to defend this f2 pawn with king f1, then queen h1 is checkmate. So the only move for white is king to h2, but this drops the pawn on f2. And there's the 5th move with that knight. Roger, with his rook under attack, chose to play rook f3, counterattacking the knight on f2, but there's a very natural retreat, knight to g4 check. Roger played king g1, and now if we go back, you can see the journey this knight made. Kind of interesting. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this knight has gone from a6, out of the game on black's queen side, to one of the most important pieces in the game, entrenched on white's king side. All right, yeah, so what to do here? What I really want to play is something like rook b to d8, trying to get my rooks active on the d file. The problem with this move is that white can play bishop to b2. I don't think Roger mentioned this in his video. White can play bishop to b2 here, and I really don't want to respond with knight f6, because that means that indefinitely there's this pressure along the A1, H8 diagonal, and if this knight ever moves again, black's just dead. So this knight is pinned, and maybe white will just kind of throw the g-pawn up the board and win a piece. So what I want to be able to do is respond with f6 when white creates that battery. But unfortunately, in this position, white has queen to c4 check, picking off the knight on g4. So I played queen e6 instead, stopping queen c4 check and protecting the knight on g4. The alternative was to do something like knight h6, but this retreats the knight from a very powerful outpost on white's king side. It's better to leave the knight on g4. So, queen e6. Where are we? Queen e6. There we go. Oh, yeah, I must have messed up the moves there a little bit. I apologize. So queen e6. Roger goes ahead and creates this battery with bishop to b2, but f6 meets it pretty well. And it's black at this point, I think, is pretty close to consolidating. Black's up a pawn. And if he can get all of his pieces into the game, then white has no compensation for the pawn, and black at that point should be technically winning. Roger chose to play e4. Another thing that this queen to e6 move did is put pressure both on the a2 and e2 pawns. Not sure how serious I was about actually taking those, as you'll see in a second, but it at least creates something he has to think about and a threat for the future, because even if I don't think it's correct to take those pawns immediately, it might be eventually. Roger played e4, just an interesting move. If I take the pawn on e4, I don't remember exactly, and I don't want to screw this video up by trying to introduce a computer. Have to do it all over again. So I think I was worried maybe about rook f4 or something similar to that, but really just wanted to get my pieces into the game. So I played rook b to d8. Roger played h5. Yeah, I don't know. There has to be something white can do that is a little more constructive than these last two moves, e4 and h5. Because black's improving his pieces, and white's not really improving his, which means that in the not-too-distant future, black's going to have pieces that are at least as good as white's, and is going to have an extra pawn, and is therefore going to be in great shape. Roger played h5. I played knight to e5, having come up with the idea to switch the places of, or not really, but to get the knight off of the g4 square so that I can use that square for my queen, which will put a lot of pressure on white's very weak king side. Rook to e3, queen g4. Okay, so the queen is threatening to take on h5. By the way, something I don't think Roger mentioned in his video is that the black queen, in supporting the d1 square, creates some potentially favorable tactics with rook d1 check. Roger took on g6 to deal with the problem of the h5 pawn. I took back. Roger checked on b3. I put my king on g7. The black king wants to be on g7 because at some point in the future, a rook on the h file in combination with the black queen and potentially the knight on e5 is going to be deadly. Roger played f1, rook f1, and I guess his idea is maybe at some point he'll play rook f4 and scare the queen away. You have to get the queen out of there somehow, so that's a reasonable idea. Yeah, okay, and rook d2 here. I think in his video Roger gives this a question mark. This is not a move I would give a question mark to, because it's a move that looks like it wins and should probably be played, you know. Let me explain what I mean. When I calculated rook d2, I looked at a number of things. One is that this queen is going to show up on h3 and then is threatening checkmates. Another issue is that the rook's going to come to h8 and combine with the rook and the queen to create all sorts of checkmate threats. Another idea is that even if this rook gets attacked on d2, there's the potential to move it to e2 or d3, supported by black's other pieces, and that should be reasonable. And when I played the move rook d2, before I played it, maybe, I don't know, a minute or two before I played it, I saw white's reply, which is bishop to c3. And it's really kind of the only move white can make. But I just kind of assumed that with all of those options, black should have a way to win here. I turned out to be wrong, but in general, moves like this, rook d2, are just winning. Okay, so here are the things I looked at here. One was to play rook to h8 or queen to h3. The moves are interchangeable. Sacrificing the rook on d2 with the idea that this battery is created and that this battery is potentially deadly. Unfortunately, white can simultaneously defend the h2 square and create a little house for his king. He can play the move rook e2, and now after queen h1 check, rook f2, something h2 check, the king's just going to go to the e1 square, and white is winning. So that doesn't really work. I was also thinking about, oh yeah, rook to g2 check. Let's see here. Another way to sacrifice the rook. King takes g2, and now rook h8, and now queen h3 check again is coming. But again, here I didn't like the tactics that would result. I think white just maintains his extra material and wins the game. Okay, so at that point I had to kind of fall back on my other two moves, which I think were rook e2 and rook d3. And I found some stuff in those lines. I don't remember what it was exactly, but I found some stuff there that I didn't really like. So this is one of those unfortunate situations in which a move that looks winning, because it has so many good follow-ups, just happens to have none of those follow-ups work out. Which is I don't think it was a mistake for me to play rook d2. I think this is an important point about practical chess play. If you see a move that looks like it should crush your opponent, especially if your opponent's low on time, which Roger was in this game, and you see all sorts of follow-ups that have the potential to win the game, and you realize that you can probably just go back, if nothing else, after you play the move, it's very likely, practically speaking, an excellent move. Okay, so here, after seeing that rook d3, rook e2, rook g2, rook h8, and queen h3 weren't working out for me, I started looking at the move rook d7, a natural move that defends the pawn on b7. And to my horror, I found a bad problem with this move as well. That's that white can play bishop takes e5, f takes e5, rook takes f8, king takes f8, rook f3 check. And this is very, to put it mildly, this is very serious counterplay for white. For example, if king e8, queen to g8 is checkmate. So the king instead has to come to g7, but white can invade with rook f7 or queen f7. White is technically down a pawn here, but he's the one attacking in a heavy piece ending. Okay, so we got to avoid that, which means I can't play rook d7 either to defend the b7 pawn. This is a very, in a way, it's a very unlucky or unfortunate situation to be in. There's really no such thing in chess, but in practical chess there is, because this move rook d2 really should just have won the game. Okay, so I think what the computer pointed out to me after the fact, I don't have a computer running now, just because I don't want to deal with the logistics of it. But I think what the computer pointed out is that a different rook sacrifice wins the game, rook h2. Or maybe, I don't know if it wins the game, but it leads to some position and some major piece endgame that's favorable for black. King takes h2, and then there's, for example, rook h8 check, and king g2, and queen h3 check. And now if the king retreats to g1, queen h2 is checkmate, so the only option is king f2, and then knight to g4 forks the king and rook. And in the computer variations I was looking at, black just kind of cleanly wins back this rook on e3 without having to lose the knight. And then white kind of sacks the bishop on f6 and then plays queen takes e3, and you end up in a heavy piece ending in which the white king is more exposed than the black one. Okay, I didn't see this, but even had I seen it, I would not have gone for it, because if you go back to this position, it's clear that the black pieces are better than the white ones, both actually and in potential. This rook on f8 has the potential to go to h8. The queen and knight and rook on d2 are amazing pieces, whereas white's rook on e3 is not very good. The rook on f1 is not doing that much, apart from that piece of counterplay I showed you a second ago. The queen's attacking b7, but that pawn looks pretty irrelevant to me at this point because the white king is under attack. Okay, bishop c3, but I did finally find an idea here that I think is reasonable for black. I played rook d to d8, which hangs the pawn on b7, but the idea here is that after queen takes b7, which was played in the game, with white threatening to take on e7 with check, now black has rook d7. And the difference is that this is coming with tempo, so there's no bishop takes e5 here, or white would lose the queen on b7. Roger played queen b5. Okay, and now I've kind of backed out of what I thought was a winning position but couldn't find a win from. And I still have excellent pieces. And this is another good point about practical chess. If you ever have a really good position and you think you can win with a certain idea, and then it turns out that you can't figure out how to win with that idea, you can often just back up and continue to have amazing pieces and continue to be much better. Rook to h8 prepares to attack white along the h-file. This position is probably very winning for black. Queen to e2, okay. So black right now is threatening queen h3, queen h2, checkmate. And also once the queen goes to h3, the knight can re-enter on g4. This is very bad news for white. This rook on the d-file is always guarding some escape squares for the white king, so it may not even be the win of material, it might just be checkmate. White has to find a way to stop that. Roger finds a nice way to do that, queen to e2, and now after queen h3 he can defend with queen g2. So checkmate avoided. Black does not really want to trade queens here because the white king is much more exposed than the black one. And that's usually a clear indication of who wants to trade queens and who doesn't. Black does not want to trade queens here, white does. So I played queen to h5. I think the computer points out that queen h6 is winning somehow, but I don't really understand the variations. It has to do with this loose rook on e2 and some other stuff. I played queen h5 instead, so that if there's a capture on e5, I can retake with the queen, so my pawn structure doesn't get destroyed. And that means, I've got too many arrows and circles here, that means that white has 4 pawn islands, and black will maintain these 2 pawn islands, and that combined with the fact that the white king is much more exposed than the black one, should mean, and that the black pieces are better than the white pieces, should mean black is winning here. I also wanted, I don't think Roger mentioned this in his video, I wanted to control the d1 square, because there are some times that rook to d1 will be a powerful move, especially a little bit later on when it potentially comes with check. So, or maybe that was earlier. Let's go back. Yeah, I think I just forgot to mention a long time ago that this move, queen g4, comes with, in some variations, the threat of rook d1 check, which could be a favorable tactical shot for black. Okay, so Roger traded on e5. He got rid of one of my attacking pieces, but to do that he had to get rid of his bishop for knight advantage, which was kind of the only thing white has here. So now it's just black's king safer than white's, black's pieces are better than white's, black's pawn structure is better than white's. This should be still winning for black. Roger played c6. All right, and here I think I kind of started to lose the thread. I played rook c7, which I think is fine. Roger defended with rook c1. He obviously can't defend with rook c3 because that drops material. And if he defends with queen c2, I don't know, maybe queen h5 is going to win the game. So he has to defend with rook c1, and now this move queen d4 attacks an undefended rook on e3 while pinning it to the king. So that's a pretty strong move. Roger finds queen f2, which is a good way to defend, and I think it was here, maybe, that the move queen b6 just picks up the pawn on c6. But I missed it. Does it? Yeah, because if rook e to c3, which looks like it defends the pawn and offers a queen trade, black has a nice shot here in rook h1 check, picking up the white queen. For example, king g2, rook h2 check. Okay, I missed that and instead played rook b8 with the idea to bring this rook down to the second rank and give this queen on f2 a really hard time, which will indirectly give the rook on e3 and the king on g1 a really hard time. I think Roger points out in his video that the move rook to e2 equalizes. So this was his chance to get back in the game. Unfortunately, though, he was extremely low on time. So he had a chance to get back in the game here, but only according to the computer, not really practically. He played rook c2 though, which is a blunder, because it allows black to take over white's back rank. Rook b1 check, king g2, queen d1, and the tactics from here aren't too difficult. Roger made a mistake here, but I don't really consider mistakes at this point in the game to really be mistakes. In fact, I have this idea that if you want to, it's a good idea when you're trying to play chess practically and you know you're losing, to play moves that, if responded to incorrectly, would get you back in the game. I'm not saying that's the case with Roger's move. It's just the reason that I usually don't describe bad moves from bad positions as blunders. So Roger played king to h3, which unfortunately allows a checkmate in 2 moves with queen h5 check, king g2, and queen h1 checkmate. Alright, so that was my first video. You get to see one or more of my cats. Get to hear me stutter my way through a bunch of chess variations. Hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're able to learn from it, and if it's well received, I might make some more in the future. Alright, thanks a lot.